Last week in class, we talked about competence to stand trial and what that looks like in Dylan Roof's case, and how he was found that he was knowledgeable enough in how a court works and what that looks like. And I noticed in a lot of our discussion boards, most of us had said that Dylan Roof was competent to stand trial. We all could agree on that. But what a lot of us also agreed on was that we didn't think that he should have been able to represent himself. So this week, I was fortunate enough to have the competence to plead guilty, which I thoroughly enjoyed doing a little bit more research on. In our textbook, the first thing that I was going to talk about is this decisional competence, which is going to be the competence to make a particular decision. This is going to be important with the competence to plead guilty because I believe, especially after doing a little bit more research, that it's going to take a higher level of competency to plead guilty than it would just to stand trial. There were a couple significant court rulings that I saw in the textbook. The first one going to be the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court basically said that a defendant must understand three different things, at least three things, to make a knowing and voluntarily plea. One, the nature of the charge pled to. Two, the penalties associated with the charge. And then three, the rights waived by the plea of guilt. Number three is also going to include things like right to a lawyer, right to cross-examine, right to have witnesses and to examine witnesses and things like that. So with this, when you are deciding whether someone is competent to plead guilty, they're basically signing away their constitutional rights to those things. So the argument to this is that it takes a higher level of competency. The next significant court ruling that I saw was Sealing versus Iman. This one was interesting just with the different outcomes that had come from it. The notable ones that I noticed in the textbook are going to be the degree of competency required to waive constitutional rights is that degree which enables him to make decisions of very serious import. This is going to chalk down to this little arrow that I have right here, which is degree of competence needed to plead guilty must be higher than needed to stand trial. My argument for that is going to be knowing the ins and outs of the courtroom and knowing those different things and how a jury works and how the courtroom works and the consequences of an action is going to take a lower level of competency than it is going to be to sign away your constitutional rights, and especially when you have mental illness involved. Down here, I wrote that a defendant is not competent to plead guilty if a mental illness has substantially impaired his ability to make a reasoned choice among the alternatives presented to him and to understand the nature of the consequences of his plea. With this, especially with the Moran case, I noticed that when he was questioned later on, after he was found competent to stand trial, when he was asked simple legal terms whether his acts were intentional or malicious or if he had planned them, he had said that he didn't know what those things were, which would be concerning if somebody had found him competent enough to stand trial and now he's defending himself. So also when he was asked why he wanted the death penalty and if he understood what that meant, he did, but also his reasoning to it was going to play a lot into his depression in the sense that he just didn't really care what had happened to him. One could also argue that that reasoning should have been taken into consideration when determining his competency to stand trial. For this next one, this is going to be the one that was in our textbook, the Moran case. The Moran case was interesting because it does not make distinctions between competency to stand trial and to plead guilty. In most jurisdictions, that is going to be the same. If someone is found competent to stand trial, they are also found competent to plead guilty. Moran's depression was not taken into consideration when assessing why he decided to plead guilty. I think this is important to note because I feel like if somebody is depressed enough to not really care what happens to them, who's to say that that mental illness doesn't hinder and reflect in their everyday choices that made them commit the crime initially? So that's going to be this slide. The next slide that I have are my media sources. So this first one right here is going to be a whole different case. This is going to be Chief Justice Berger's opinion against majority ruling on Feretta versus California. The whole thing is interesting, but if you read the dissertation at the very end, I think that that is going to play well into just give you a different opinion and perspective on the discussion question that I have. I also have an article on the Moran case that we had. It just goes a little bit more in detail and gives a little bit more information on that. I also have a Slate article. It wasn't the most academically profound article, But I thought it was interesting because it provided a perspective of how, assuming that competence to plead guilty and competence to stand trial are the same, it has kind of earned the name of court-assisted suicide, and how people with mental illness, especially depression, could use that as a way to commit suicide. So I thought that that was a very interesting perspective, and one that should be taken into consideration when determining things like mental illness and how that plays into court and someone's competency to stand guilty. So please look into those. My discussion question is going to be, should there be a higher level of competency to plead guilty than to stand trial? And should the reason a defendant wants to plead guilty be used to determine competency? One, competency to plead guilty, but also the competency to stand trial.